Hello, everybody. I'm Faris. I'm a partner on the team here at Flare Capital, joined by Mike Gao. He's the CEO and co-founder of our portfolio company, SmarterDx. It's a seed investment that we co-led in 2022, which is just announced. It has raised growth funding from New Mountain Capital and will now form a part of Smarter Technologies, which is a new AI-enabled administrative efficiency platform for hospital systems and healthcare. We're going to talk a lot more about that later today. But firstly, Mike, thanks for joining us today. And before we jump into it, I'm going to provide a little bit of background. So Mike and I actually first met in 2018 at New York Presbyterian Hospital. I was on the venture and innovation team there, and we were responsible for sourcing AI solutions for the hospital system. And then Mike was the medical director of applied AI at New York Presbyterian Hospital, and he was actually also a practicing clinician at that time. And we worked closely together at NYP. I got to see Mike and his co-founder, Josh, in action. They both built and deployed physician-facing AI solutions within the hospital, but they also shepherded a lot of our AI partnerships that the hospital structured. So you guys really had this like holistic vantage point into emerging technologies. And Mike and I, fast forward, stayed in touch in 2022. We at Flare Capital were super lucky to have the chance to co-lead SmarterDX's seed fundraising round with Floodgate. And now, just 3 years later, SmarterDx is approaching almost 100 million in revenue. They've raised growth capital from New Mountain. And Mike, you have this privileged trust now with senior executives at hospitals and an opportunity to really shape the future of healthcare AI right as it's starting to emerge. So for healthcare enterprise leaders looking for trusted partners to scale their AI programs, and for founders looking to build healthcare AI solutions, we thought it would be really valuable to unpack this company's journey and then some key learnings along the way. So that's a setup. And Mike, I'm going to pass the mic over to you here. Maybe tell us a little bit more about SmarterDx. What do you do and what's your scale, reach, and set of capabilities today?
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate the chance to hop on this and have really enjoyed working together both before SmarterDx and certainly these past few years as well. At a very high level, we use AI to ingest and understand clinical data. And then we use that understanding to make sure that documentation and medical coding are fully complete and accurate. And it's something that sounds, I think, to people outside of healthcare, hey, why is this so difficult? Why isn't this already being done? But I think the way I would frame it is that there's 130,000 possible diagnosis and procedure codes, and your average hospitalized patient will have 15 to 20. So you can just imagine the combinatorial complexity. And in doing this and helping hospitals represent the care that they're delivering more accurately, represent their patients more accurately, we actually help hospitals get paid for the care that they've delivered. And in the past 3 years, I think a true average across all clients, we're helping hospitals make something on the order of $2 million per 10,000 discharges, which has been really amazing. And I think the journey, both for our customer base and both as a founder, is, I think, first about making a real difference and creating real value. And then second, about getting people to actually believe you. Because, of course, lots and lots of vendors will go to lots and lots of hospitals and say, we bring more value. And so I think understanding how to approach that in a way that's been unlocked with this new wave of AI, and then understanding how to bring that to market are really the two big things that we needed to solve as a company.
And that's such an important point. And we're going to go back to this topic of building trust and transparency in healthcare, which has been so important to SmarterDX's growth. But before we do that, Mike, you have this really interesting background, right? Going all the way back to the origin story, not just of the business, but Mike Gao, you made this decision to go to medical school and then you practice medicine. That's a huge commitment, but you also have a technical skill set. So maybe tell us a little bit about how did this all come together and when did you know you wanted to build something?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Before medical school, I was actually more interested originally in math and engineering. long story short, I met Terrence Tao at UCLA. He's a field medalist and maybe the most brilliant mathematician of our generation. And I realized that I would probably not make one iota of difference in mathematics relative to him. In medical school, you're making a difference. And I think what I liked about that was that it was really tangible. You need to see the difference you're making at an individual level. And in medical school at the University of Michigan, I had started in my first couple of years a student-run free clinic. And we put together labs, radiology, primary care, and so on and so forth for the underinsured population. And I think in our first year, we saw something on the order of 1,000 patients. And I remember there were a ton of accolades, a ton of pats on the back, but that was right after the Affordable Care Act had gotten passed, but there were still around 40 million Americans without health insurance at the time. And I remember just thinking to myself that 1,000 divided by 40 million, you don't have to be Terrence Tao to know that's not a huge fraction of sort of the US population. And we started putting together separately another nonprofit, which was a ZocDoc for people without health insurance to match those patients with kind of potential resources. And that was used by social workers to help identify needs for care. And I think that reinforced to me that the choice was not between kind of something in the abstract, but technology and technical, or practical and tangible. But through technology, through people, you can both have something that is high leverage and makes a wide amount of impact, and something that makes a very real impact, that makes a sort of a difference in the present. And so I think that was what led me to say, hey, I'm just looking out for opportunities to make a bigger difference in healthcare.
And speaking of opportunities, Mike, you and I have chatted about a couple of different ideas you've had over time. Some you were thinking about in parallel to when you started to think about the market opportunity that you ended up tackling with SmarterDx. It's interesting. The first seed deck you shared with me, I think SmarterDx was going to be in 30 hospitals in 3 years. And typically we see that type of forecast, the seed, and we always discount it a little bit, but like you guys beat that forecast pretty soundly. And so there's a lot that went into that, which we're going to discuss today. But the market opportunity is so interesting. The time at which you went after the market opportunity is also really interesting. As you thought about the different opportunities that you wanted to pursue, was the idea for SmarterDx the first one you came up with? Did you build up to it over time? Just how did you get to the point of kind of having conviction to go after this?
Yeah, I think my time in working with Josh and yourself at New York Presbyterian was just incredibly formative because in addition to internal projects that we were doing, I also got to work with kind of a bunch of startups or early stage startups that were entering the hospital at that time. And I think that at a very high level, of course, this is just a bit more black and white than it actually is. There were some companies that were able to solve deep technical problems, but had challenges really clearly being able to identify the value that they are creating. And then there were companies, more or less many of the incumbents, just generally speaking in healthcare, that maybe technologically weren't as advanced on the basis of having worked with hospitals for many years, really understood and were able to speak to the value that they were creating. And superficially, CDI is if you're outside of healthcare, clinical documentation improvement just feels like some niche area. But it's actually incredibly interesting because to improve documentation in the first place, especially for inpatient care where you're not actually talking to the patient that much. You think of your ICU patient that's on a ventilator. You really have to be able to infer from the fingerprint of care that's delivered what the intent was, what the diagnoses were. And at the time, the transformer technology AI approach, clinical BERT, and things like that were just beginning to be more and more widely used. And of course, that's now what's behind the T in ChatGPT. And then the other part about CDI that was very interesting is you could trace a clear line between a few words in documentation to a medical code, to a DRG, and then to an increase in reimbursement, rather than harder things like measuring efficiency or operational excellence or quality, although those things are also very important. And so there's this Venn diagram overlap between something that, the specific way we're doing it was just beginning to be unlocked with a new wave of technology, but also something that when you make an impact has clearly attributable value to customers. And I think there are many ideas that I had, some of which we've discussed, that were in either bucket 1 or bucket 2, but this was super unique in that it was the overlap of those two Venn diagram circles.
And you talked a little bit about how the experiences you had at NYP were formative, and you had an opportunity, if you wanted to, Mike, to even maybe build this within NYP, right? Before deciding that you wanted to form SmarterDx. How did you think about that, staying an operator and creating that impact and scaling it within New York City's population, or NYP's population, I should say, versus scaling it via SmarterDx? Did you ever weigh that trade-off, or was it pretty clear cut to you what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think initially the idea came about through my experience at New York Presbyterian, and myself and a couple other people within the hospital were able to build initial prototypes using very simple, more rules-based approaches to identify value. And I think it's challenging though, because hospitals have a very thin operating margin. And when we have a thin operating margin, it's a little bit like you're not saving much at the end of your biweekly paycheck. And therefore it's hard to make large capital investments and like grow things over time unless there's a very clear defined ROI at the end of it. And I think trying to get the amount of capital allocation to hire the level of talent that we needed to hire to build the real AI engine behind SmarterDx was just not possible. And at the end of the day, hospitals differentiate by providing really excellent patient care, and not by generally hiring a bunch of Stanford PhDs to build new technology. And I think that was when the talent led me to think about, hey, should this be done outside of the hospital? And then of course, what's beautiful about technology is the infinite scalability of it. And so if you build it once, you can help not just one hospital, but every hospital. And I think that's where it became more and more obvious that starting a company was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And I know we're going to get back to this theme a little bit later, but I'm curious from your perspective, many hospitals have experimented with trying to develop and build and scale technology within their four walls. Many have obviously partnered with companies like SmarterDx to achieve those aims. From your vantage point, given those thin operating margins, are there certain things that are obvious for hospitals to continue to own and build internally? Do you think that changes over time at all with AI?
I do think that over time, AI will decrease the cost of development. And I think it's important for hospitals to understand their own data to some degree. So I actually think a pretty strong analytics team is important, because it's any vendor that says, hey, we made X degree of difference. You want the capacity in the hospital to be able to validate what the different impacts of kind of everyone you're working with or your own internal projects really are. I think one of the things that I think there's a few things where it's very difficult internally. I think one is, frankly, just the level of talent. Your $500K a year data scientist, your $350K a year principal engineer, those people are actively being recruited by Google, by Meta, by OpenAI. literally, I think one of our data scientists picked between us and Anthropic as an example. And so I think it's hard as a hospital to allocate the budget necessary and to achieve the leverage necessary to justify that budget to bring that level of talent on board. I think the second thing really is that building something is one thing, maintaining it over time is a whole nother set of resources. And I think that's often underappreciated. Code is, in some sense, a ever evolving organism. You have to do things in a highly secure way. You have to constantly identify on bugs and iterate on that. You have to understand different workflows and manage that. You have to refactor code. You have to solve technical debt and all of those things. And I think oftentimes what happens in a hospital is, hey, even if you can get the budget to build it in the first place and make a difference, can you get that budget on a recurring basis for all time to maintain it, to update the code if, the EHR changes or the data schema changes? And then if you don't, the software just depreciates over time. I think we were one of the best positioned hospitals, and maybe still are, to build things internally. You have not just Cornell, but Columbia associated with the hospital and a ton of talent coming in through those pipelines. And I think there's some hospitals in the country that are able to do some level of internal innovation. I was talking the other day to Michael Pfeffer at Stanford. He's the CIO there. And probably one of the better resource, maybe one of the best resource hospitals, both in capital and in talent. And he still said, if Epic can do it, they go with Epic. If there's a platform partner that can do it, they go with them. If there's a outside partner, a startup that can do it, they go with the startup. And only after all those routes are exhausted will they build something internally. I think because they understand that cost over time.
Great points, Mike. And what I'm curious about is, so going back to your founding story, and so you guys go out in 2022, you raise seed funding, the business is off and running. Now, I have this really interesting question, because I know it's always hard to tell, and you're constantly kind of processing different signals to understand this notion of product market fit. But I'm really curious, at what point in the SmarterDx journey, and this, maybe you realized it even before you went out and raised seed funding, did you realize that, hey, this works? I think we will find product market fit, or I think we found it. And at that point, did you make different decisions about how you'd run the company?
Yeah, I think before we raised our seed, Josh and I effectively bootstrapped for a number of years to build a lot of the initial technology and scaffolding. And I think our burn rate has always been pretty disciplined, but I think really through after Series A, we were still burning trivial amounts. And I think when we raised seed, we knew we had sales market fit. In other words, we had repeated buyers of a sales pitch that we were making. And I think with our business model, there wasn't that much risk, but it was still a leap of faith for those first couple customers to partner with a company that hadn't done it a dozen times before. And I remember when we turned our algorithms on in customer number one, I was just staring at my computer monitor the entire day, because how do you really know until you know? So that there really is opportunity. And I still remember the first agreed diagnosis recommendation that we captured. And I think it was by the end of 2022, we had made $400K worth of difference at our first customer, a relatively small 300 bed hospital. And we were annualizing closer to 10 million at our other customer, which is like an 8 hospital system in Michigan. And I think that's when I really knew that we had product market fit. And it was just a matter of making sure that the market was aware of the results that we were achieving. And by the end of most of 2023, we were just in the first innings of building out that sales and marketing and go-to-market functions. That's when we brought on Wayne, our chief commercial officer. And I think between September and December of 2023, I think we 4x'd or something the amount of revenue we had as a company. And so that was when we were really sure that we had product market fit.
And actually, maybe on that point, there's been this really interesting dynamic at SmarterDx, which is unlike many of the companies in our portfolio, where I'd say, as you thought about the seed, the A and the B, you obviously went out and you deliberately raised the seed. But then I'd say after that, capital almost found you, right? Maybe before you were ready to take it on. And each time, or each of those inflection points, you had a couple of different offers and a couple of different ways in which to think about the path forward. But you made such a first principle set of decisions on what the final outcome you wanted to be was. And I distinctly remember this one round where you were considering maybe walking away from a really compelling offer, but you took a lot of time, or I said you took the due amount of time to really holistically triangulate all the inputs from the board, advisors, other founders in your network before taking capital. And obviously it's led to this outcome here today, but can you talk a little bit about how you approached fundraising at each point in the company's journey? And we'll talk a little bit about smarter technology. So let's save that for kind of the end. But how did these offers come to fruition? Did you cultivate them? Was it opportunistic? And then how do you think about navigating the right outcome?
Yeah, I think one of the things that founders often make an error on is that a funding round is not a finish line or a victory in really any way. It is a set of promises that you are making. And hopefully the set of promises leads to maybe at least roughly, say, a 3x increase in value for the company in between rounds. And it's important to make those promises and deliver on them because you lose, obviously, some fraction of ownership and some fraction of control over the company. And if you have to redo a lot of rounds over time, that's really not good for anyone involved. And so I think my question in each round was, what can we prove and what can we get to without the funding versus what can we get to with the funding? And so I think one of the huge advantages that we had was Josh and I are both quite technical. We're both physicians. We're both able to talk to kind of hospitals. And we were very deliberate about not raising a seed round until we had effectively signed contracts in hand, because you don't need a seed round to make some PowerPoint sales slides. And if both founders are technical, you don't need a seed round to build the first version of a product either. So I think at the time of raising our seed round, obviously we wanted the capital to bring in the level of talent needed to scale the product up. But I knew that if I made the promise that I could bring this product and people would buy it, I knew at the time of raising that I could fulfill that promise. And I think in terms of choice of partner, I think it's a lot like assembling a team. In Floodgate, and there is amazing. She was a seed investor in Lyft and Twitter and Twitch, a bunch of household names, and is well connected in the Silicon Valley community. And that was very complimentary to two physicians on the East Coast from a talent recruitment perspective. And I think the problem to solve, of course, in healthcare is that selling to hospitals is really hard. And so you want to bring as much firepower as you can bear on that problem. And that was what really led to wanting to work with yourself and the Flare team. And then I think what's nice for founders, maybe less nice for VCs, is that there's probably more capital out there looking for great companies to invest in than there are great companies in need of capital. And I think we knew that if we maintained 100% focus on customers, and that's really all we did, and we made our customers successful, and then in turn, like that would help us be successful. We knew that happy customers leads to funding interest. But it's important to know that the reverse, again, is not true, right? Happy funding does not lead magically to customers in any sense of the word. And I think we maintained that focus. And then over the years, I think both Steve at Bessemer and Todd at Transformation are very well connected within the healthcare market. And so I think had the inside track in terms of understanding from the market how we were doing and how receptive audiences were. And they presented compelling sort of arguments for why we should work with them.
Great overview and kind of summary of how you navigated that, Mike. And maybe if we take a step forward and you reflect back on the journey of SmarterDx, and maybe we look at the business from the lens of kind of 4 key areas: team, product, market, go-to-market, and business model. Very curious as you reflect back again, what you think you did uniquely well on each dimension, and if you have any regrets or anything you would have done differently on each of these dimensions. I'd love to hear that too. So maybe starting with team, you led off the top with this. You and Josh, 2 clinicians, you have some technical knowledge, but you're both first-time founders. So how did you think about where your gaps were right out of the gate and how you thought about addressing them, and how did that change over time? And then is there a hire that you wish you had made sooner or later as you think back on the journey?
Yeah, I think that in some ways, the job of the founders is to be very persuasive, whether that's to customers or to talent. And certainly in early 2022, that was still in peak bubble time. I think broadly speaking, if you could touch type, Google would give you an offer. So it was like a pretty scrappy time for trying to get talent. And I think what helped us differentiate was, I think there are a decent number of founders that are technical, but not experienced from an industry perspective. Your average 24-year-old and Y Combinator or something. And that has its own set of advantages. And then there's a decent number of founders who are great business people and very experienced in the markets that they're going after, but aren't really technologists. And I think from a recruitment standpoint, our first sort of critical hires were in engineering and data science. And I think what helped was they could sense that we were both, and we could speak to them at the level of like specific technical challenges that we were trying to solve. And I think in terms of what we could have done better from a talent level, I will say, I think going back to your earlier question, which is when did you sense that you had product market fit? I think it's hard to be sure the first time you're selling to hospitals because your average sales cycle is anywhere between 6 to 18 months. So if you imagine if 8 months in, you haven't made a sale, is it because your product isn't very good, or is it just because that's like how things work? And I think we were, I would say, maybe 6 to 8 months delayed in fully appreciating that we had product market fit. And I think that there's a mindset sort of pre-product market fit, which is, how do I conserve capital and make sure I have the runway I need to build and iterate and things like that. And I think once we have product market fit, the mindset, like true product market fit, I should say, the mindset shifts to how do I capture as much as possible within as short of amount of time as possible. And I probably wish I had transitioned that mindset sort of 6 to 8 months earlier. And that was probably one of the disadvantages of being not just a first time founder, but effectively a first time seller to hospitals where it was harder to read the room.
And you said something interesting there, which is you were looking for those early signs of product market fit. And I think that as you try and track those signals, that can dictate how You flex different levers in the business, make different ends to the business to accelerate growth. But the really interesting thing about SmarterDx is that oftentimes there's this push, right, at companies to be a multi-product company too early on. And that risks diluting focus and the value proposition. Actually, in the first deck, I think you presented to us, CDI was like this wedge to a broader end-to-end revenue cycle product. But interestingly, clinical documentation improvement has remained the predominant product for SmarterDx, even though we frequently wrestled with the notion of expanding into a platform strategy and the right timing to do that. So what signals, Mike, were you tracking over the journey of the company to decide whether to quickly ramp up to additional products or stick to what we had? And knowing what you know now, would you have made a different decision in the company's journey?
I would say that you want to expand to multiple products as quickly as possible, as long as your principal value is not eroded and, for lack of better words, doesn't explode. And after our first year in 2024, we grew, over 5x. Last year we grew, 23 over 5x. Last year we grew something like 6x. The first quarter of this year, we grew another 2x. And so I think there's some component of we would have loved to expand our product roadmap sooner. But when you're growing at a 30x clip every 2 years, you can't sacrifice results, stability, customer joy, and many of those things. And our hand was forced, for lack of better words, to prioritize pre-bill. As recently, we've released that second product on the denial side, and I think the core thesis continues and is a big reason we're joining forces with other companies and forming smarter technologies. Because I do think that on average, hospitals want to not work with thousands of point solutions and want large partners. And if you can be both a large partner, but not dilute the technology edge and the innovation edge, I think that's a really key play. But the short of it is, it potentially in a world where I was smarter or more experienced or something like that, we would have expanded to more products even faster.
And so to just dig on that point a little bit more, were there signals in the pipeline? Obviously, you talked about our growth that we were seeing on a year-over-year basis, but were there signals in the pipeline that were suggesting, hey, there's more room to run here? Because we've talked a lot about this, obviously, at the board level, in healthcare tech in particular, and selling into hospital systems, because of the nature of a lot of these incumbent legacy relationships, sometimes you can hit what I call like a flat curve on growth before much faster than you might expect. And it may not necessarily present itself in your pipeline. And so there's that element of it. Like, what signals do we track and how do we know to keep going versus to double down? And it's probably always good to be proactive, but some of this is also because of that trust you built, like, customers are pulling you towards a second product already, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think with respect to hitting the flat part of the curve, I think this is the classic crossing the chasm dilemma. And I think there's different stages, right? I think there's lots of startups that can hit 1 or 2 million in contract value. And that's the early adopter, super innovator, will try something out set of hospitals. And then there's the next batch, which is you're still being brought into hospitals because you're seen as innovative. But I think what gave us a ton of confidence that we wouldn't hit a plateau is across our customer base, there's both super innovative, top academic medical center type hospitals, and there's, for lack of better words, meat and potatoes community hospitals where, hey, we're just trying to keep the lights on and deliver patient care the way that we want to. And so I think, from looking at our customer profile, I would have been a lot more worried about hitting a plateau if all of our customers were in that first bucket. But we've had a pretty wide range of customers from day one.
Can you talk a little bit about the go-to-market and business model? Because that has been a critical unlock and hack for you guys in terms of growth and distribution velocity?
Yeah. When we started, I was trying to approach things from a concurrent CDI perspective. So, in other words, improve documentation as the physician is writing that documentation, which is, from a product perspective, the most intuitive approach. And I think that the pushback was, and pushback in sales calls tends to be very subtle. So you have to like really listen for it. Was you're asking a lot for me to redo how I do CDI today. And when we talked about, explored sort of ways to remove financial risk from our customers, i.e. through contingency, customers are like, how do I really know that if you find something, you're not just front running something our team would have identified anyway? And that very much brought me back to the New York Presbyterian days where, as you remember, we'd kick off a great project and then 6 months later, finance would say, wait, let's recalculate the impact here. What do we really believe? And, I squirm a little bit under that spotlight. And so I think the response to those was to move to what's called pre-bill, which is after discharge, so retrospective from that perspective, but before billing still. So prospective still with respect to billing. And that had the advantages of still being close enough to the time of patient care that it wasn't that painful from a workflow perspective, but suddenly having, because you're coming after everything else, 100% attributable dollars. And so when I say 2 million per 10,000 discharges, that's not hand wavy before and after. These are case level findings where the hospital's already gone through that case and we're finding dollars on top of whatever they're employing currently. I think that clarity of attribution is really what unlocked our go-to-market. But what's interesting here is there's a transition point when I was trying to give prospective customers the option. So I was saying, we do both concurrent and pre-bill CDI. And it wasn't until we simplified the story and made it just pre-bill where the market really got it. And I think the other thing to remember is that all of these hospital leaders, CDI directors, VPs of finance are getting pitched to by 25 different vendors a week. And so I think really like simplifying the value proposition and making sure that's really clear is a critical discovery.
You went at risk and you were confident in going at risk because of your product positioning and early performance data. That's really interesting. Maybe, Mike, this is a question that's going to tee up the most recent milestone for the company, but talk a little bit about the market, because this shaped a lot of kind of how you and the leadership team ultimately came to the decision you came to today. The revenue cycle space is obviously inundated with solutions, especially now recently AI solutions. I'm curious how you've seen the market evolve versus what you thought when you first started the company, and how what's been going on in the market has shaped your decision to obviously partner with New Mountain Capital and launch Smarter Technologies.
Yeah, I think the fundamental question, of course, is how do you provide the most value possible to your customers? And with respect to building new products, there's really two ways to do it. There's organic growth, and then there's partnering with other people and joining forces together to do it. In markets where cycles are very fast, like social media as an example, or consumer markets, organic growth can be very fast because at a broad level, you can iterate, test it, and build new things relatively quickly. The consequence of a market where the sales cycles are that 9 to 18 months is that actually also means that organic iteration times are slow. Because if you build something, it then takes 9 to 18 months at least to know if there's much receptivity, for sure. And I think as AI becomes more and more accessible, the need to outpace incumbents with lots of distribution is greater because it's easier to innovate potentially than it used to be before. And so I think that was why we started looking for, potential capital partners that were really good at inorganic growth. Like, how do you form partnerships in a real way and grow that way? And I think the other piece was from where the capital comes from was, I think, the thinking about the over time disconnect between venture capital and more liquid later stage markets. And again, the problem here is that, sort of as I alluded to earlier, venture capital is not a finish line or a victory, it's a promise. And the higher the valuation is, the bigger the promise you have to make is. And, that leads to stories that we've all heard before, Olive and things like that. And at the early stage, when it's 20, 50, 100 or something like that, I think it's still sustainable because in some ways at the early stage, you can find strategic buyers that are willing to spot you a very high value to revenue multiple. But at the later stages, that's no longer true. Outside of healthcare, occasionally you'll see players like Google or something make some huge acquisition, but within healthcare, those players don't really exist. And I think as we mapped out the path to being a public company and in that vein, a sustainable business that is bringing our customers value for decades to come, I think it was more and more clear that accelerating that move to platforms through kind of inorganic product growth was the right strategy.
And what elements of the platform do you think set it up well, Mike, to achieve like your next, let's call it like 2 to 5 year vision, right? You're partnered now with Access Healthcare and Thoughtful AI. What do the next couple of years look like for SmarterDx, both as a unit within Smarter Technologies, but the combined company broadly?
Yeah, I think I've been speaking with Matt Hull, the president at New Mountain, and Jeremy Dolinsky, the CEO of the Smarter Technologies company now for half a year. And I think what's nice here in terms of what sets things up well is that the North Star is the same, which is very broadly help providers and bend the cost curve of healthcare. And so I think when the high level values are aligned, the specific tactics are flexible and can change. With AI, I think one fundamental question is what maintains differentiation over time? And I would say it's really two things. One is access to data, the ability to then use that data to generate insights, which is a lot of what we do. And then the other is, in some sense, unrecorded data, which is know-how. Like, how exactly does submitting a prior auth for this type of ambulatory surgery in this state at this practice work? And what's interesting is, I think, in the pre-AI era, BPOs, so to speak, were not super interesting because, yeah, maybe you can take that know-how, refine it, and 5% more costs or something. But I think in the AI era, actually, that know-how is its own source of kind of knowledge capital, for lack of better words, for your models. And so I think that's where the breadth of know-how that sort of access and then together with Thoughtful bring to the table was just really exciting.
Awesome. Mike, this has been incredibly valuable. I want to say thanks again for taking the time out to do this, to chat with us, to share a little bit more about the story. We're super happy for you. Congratulations to you and the team again. Really impressive milestone in a dynamic capital market, and really excited for all that's ahead for Smarter Technologies.
Awesome, Parth. It's been a great ride so far and look forward to the future.